In this video, I want to start the topic of fiscal policy. And essentially, fiscal policy is the alternative to monetary policy. Both are government intervention, what we sometimes call activist policy, to try to stabilize the business cycle. So fiscal policy involves changes in government spending or taxation to pursue macroeconomic policy goals, including maximum sustainable GDP, high employment, and price level stability. You'll notice that these goals are very similar to monetary policy goals. The real difference is, with monetary policy, the Fed is changing the money supply to pursue these macroeconomic policy goals, whereas with fiscal policy, the federal government is changing spending and taxation policy to influence macroeconomic goals. Now, when we say the federal government, we really mean the president and Congress. Those are the two areas where spending and taxation are managed. Let's say we're in a recession. Well, that's going to necessitate expansionary policy. Expansionary policy in fiscal terms would be to increase government spending. The government can start buying more stuff and or cut taxes. By lowering taxes or sending out rebate checks to people will spend more money. In both cases, more spending occurs, and that increases GDP, and we get an increase in the price level. If we're in an expansion where we have a booming economy, but inflation is rearing its ugly head, then the policy might be contractionary. In this case, we do the opposite. The government would spend less, they'd buy less stuff, and or raise taxes. By raising taxes, you would have less money to buy stuff. In both cases, there'd be less spending in the economy, and that would lower GDP, and the price level would fall. Another way to look at fiscal policy is in our aggregate demand diagram. When we're dealing with activist policy, whether it's monetary or fiscal, the goal is to shift aggregate demand. If it's expansionary policy, then they want to shift aggregate demand to the right. And we'll see in a bit that once we put the supply curve in here, how it affects output and the price level. But for now, we can just take a look at how aggregate demand moves. So let's say we start here at aggregate demand curve 1. Real GDP on the horizontal axis, price level on the vertical. Let's say that the government implements, because we're in a recession, expansionary policy. So they're going to spend more and or cut taxes. Well, that's going to shift aggregate demand to the right from AD1 to AD2. Let's imagine that the initial increase in aggregate demand is 100 billion. And let's just keep it simple and say this comes from government purchases, and so they're not using tax cuts here. It wouldn't really matter. It's just the 100 billion in initial aggregate demand increase is coming from them spending more rather than them giving you tax breaks and you spending more. So this aggregate demand curve shifts to the right by 100 billion. Now, what's interesting is that's going to initiate a process called a multiplier process. And that initial 100 billion is actually going to create more than 100 billion in new aggregate demand. It's like throwing a rock in a pond. This is the initial splash, and then this is after all the ripples have occurred. You can think of it kind of like this. The aggregate demand curve shifts by 100 billion, and then it shifts in steps until it reaches its final destination. One thing about fiscal policy is generally the government shifts into either a budget deficit or a budget surplus when they're implementing the policy. For example, if we have a recession and they're going to try to expand the economy, then they're going to shift into deficit. Why? Because they want to put more money in the economy, that is, spend more and cut taxes. Well, that is inherently deficit creating. If the government spends more and reduces taxes, then they're going to have to borrow the difference. So expansionary fiscal policy usually necessitates deficits. In contrast, if we're in a expansion, a boom, and they want to implement contractionary policy, then they would shift the budget into surplus. In other words, they would decrease spending and raise taxes. Well, that moves the government into surplus. They're spending less and they're raising taxes, so more money will start to flow into government than flowing out. And that would help stifle the inflation from the expanding economy. Regardless, whether the government is using deficit policy to correct a recession or surplus policy to correct an expansion, there is that initial effect and then the multiplier effect. Let's elaborate a little more on this multiplier effect. Following the same logic, the initial effect, that shift from 81 to 82, that's called the autonomous effect. And then the subsequent shift from 82 to 83 is called the multiplier or induced effect. The autonomous effect is pretty straightforward. If the government puts $100 billion in new purchases in the economy, there's $100 billion in new aggregate demand. You can see that in this table here, row 1, and you can also see it over here in this time period graph. Time period 1, $100 billion is being put in the economy. The induced effect, however, is a little more complicated and requires us to understand two new concepts. The first is called the marginal propensity to consume. This is essentially the fraction of each dollar that is earned in the economy spent. So if someone in the economy earns $1, what fraction of that would they actually use to go out and buy things with? In this illustration here, we have a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8, which means for every dollar that is generated in income in the economy, we would expect people to consume 80 cents of it. Now that leads us to the other term, the marginal propensity to save, which is always 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So in this example, that would be 20 cents or 0.2. In other words, for every dollar earned in this economy, 80 cents would be spent, consumed, and 20 cents would be saved. Note that if you add the marginal propensity to consume of 0.8 to the marginal propensity to save of 0.2, you get 1. Now with that, the induced multiplier effect is going to depend on the marginal propensity to consume and save. And what we're going to see is the higher the marginal propensity to consume, that is, the lower the marginal propensity to save, the more pronounced the multiplier effect is going to be. In this illustration here and here, we're going to assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.5. So disregard these numbers here for this example. That means if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.5, then the marginal propensity to save must also be 0.5. In other words, for every dollar in income earned, people are going to spend half and they're going to save half. Let's go back to our initial autonomous effect. The government puts $100 billion in new government purchases in the economy. That leads to an initial $100 billion in new spending. Period 1, $100 billion. But that's going to, like a rock in the pond, create a induced effect, multiplier effect, ripples. In period 2, you're actually going to see $50 billion in consumption spending. Why? Well, because in period 1, the government spent $100 billion, which led to $100 billion in new aggregate demand, which led to $100 billion in new production, income, and half of it was spent in period 2. So if $100 billion in new spending and real GDP is created in period 1, then that means $100 billion in income flowed to households. Remember, real GDP and income are the same thing. If $100 billion in period 1 flowed to households and they consume half of it, then there's $50 billion in consumption spending in period 2, leading us by the end of period 2 to $150 billion in cumulative spending and real GDP increases. The rock was $100 billion. The first ripple takes us to $150. In our graph here, in time period 2, we get an increase in consumption spending of 50 billion. So it adds to that 100 billion from period 1, the 50 billion in consumption from period 2. Let's keep going. By the end of period 2, we have 150 billion in spending. Well, that's 50 billion in new GDP and spending from period 2. Half of that will be spent in period 3. So we have 25 billion in new consumption spending, taking us to a total of 175 billion. Period 3, we have 150 from periods 1 and 2. We add 25. So we're up to 175. Then we go to period 4. Well, if in period 3, 25 billion in spending occurred and 25 billion in additional GDP occurred, then 25 billion in income flowed to households and they spent half of it. So in period 4, we have 12.5 billion in consumption spending, taking us to 187.5. And the process continues. Now, it would be very tedious to go through every possible period. The good news is we're going to have a formula that will take us from that autonomous effect through all the multiplied induced effects and get us to the total effect. So at the end of all these periods, we're going to see that the cumulative increase in spending will be 200 billion. That's derived by looking at what's called the spending multiplier. And it's a simple formula. It's just 1 over the marginal propensity to save. So for example, let's go back. Our marginal propensity to save in this illustration was 0.5. So we take 1 over 0.5, which is 2, right? 1 over 0.5 is 2. That means that that initial autonomous effect of 100 billion is going to be multiplied by 2, getting us to, at the end of all these periods, 200 billion. We don't have to go through all the periods. We can jump from the autonomous effect to the total effect by using the multiplier. In some cases, rather than changing spending, the government might change taxes. So we have a tax multiplier as well. It's a little bit different. In the numerator, it's negative MPC, marginal propensity to consume, over NPS, marginal propensity to save. So using the same numbers, if we calculate the tax multiplier, it's going to be negative 0.5 over 0.5, which would give us negative 1. What does that mean? It means that if the government were to, let's say, lower taxes by 100 billion to stimulate the economy rather than increase government purchases, then there would be a negative 100 billion in taxes in autonomous effect. We would multiply that by negative 1, our tax multiplier, and we would get negative 100 times negative 1 is positive 100. In other words, the total effect would be 100 billion from a tax decrease. Whereas with a spending increase, we get 200 billion. We'll pick up with this and some examples in the next video.